Strategies for successful mergers and acquisitions. Companies adopt different strategies for creating value through mergers, but only few are successful. In this session we are going to discuss couple of successful M&A strategies. There is no magic formula to make acquisitions successful. Each deal must have its own strategic logic. Acquirers in the most successful deals have specific, well-articulated value creation ideas going in. For less successful deals, the strategic rationales, such as pursuing international scale, filling portfolio gaps, or building a third leg of the portfolio, tend to be vague. Types of strategies. An acquisition strategic rationale should be a specific articulation of one of these archetypes, not a vague concept like growth or strategic positioning, which may be important but must be translated into something more tangible. Furthermore, even if your acquisition is based on one of the archetypes below, it won't create value if you overpay. Improve the target company's performance. Improving the performance of the target company is one of the most common value-creating acquisition strategies. You buy a company and radically reduce costs to improve margins and cash flows. In some cases, the acquirer may also take steps to accelerate revenue growth. Keep in mind that it is easier to improve the performance of a company with low margins and low returns on invested capital (ROIC) than that of a high-margin, high ROIC company. Consider a target company with a 6% operating profit margin. Reducing costs by 3 percentage points to 91% of revenues, from 94%, increases the margin to 9% and could lead to a 50% increase in the company's value. In contrast, if the operating profit margin of a company is 30%, increasing its value by 50% requires increasing the margin to 45%. That might not be reasonable to expect. Consolidate to remove excess capacity from industry. As industries mature, they typically develop excess capacity. In chemicals, for example, companies are constantly looking for ways to get more production out of their plants, even as new competitors continue to enter the industry. The combination of higher production from existing capacity and new capacity from recent entrants often generates more supply than demand. Companies often find it easier to shut plants across the larger combined entity resulting from an acquisition than to shut their least productive plants without one and end up with a smaller company. Reducing excess in an industry can also extend to less tangible forms of capacity. Consolidation in the pharmaceutical industry, for example, has significantly reduced the capacity of the sales force as the product portfolios of merged companies change and they rethink how to interact with doctors. Accelerate market access for the target's products. IBM, for instance, has pursued this strategy in its software business. Between 2010 and 2013, IBM acquired 43 companies for an average of $350 million each. By pushing the products of these companies through IBM's global sales force, IBM estimated that it was able to substantially accelerate the acquired company's revenues, sometimes by more than 40% in the first 2 years after each acquisition. Often, relatively small companies with innovative products have difficulty reaching the entire potential market for their products. Small pharmaceutical companies, for example, typically lack the large sales forces required to cultivate relationships with the many doctors they need to promote their products. Bigger pharmaceutical companies sometimes purchase these smaller companies and use their own large-scale sales forces to accelerate the sales of the smaller company's products. In some cases, the target can also help accelerate the acquirer's revenue growth. In Procter & Gamble's acquisition of Gillette, the combined company benefited because working together, they introduced their products into new markets much more quickly. Get skills faster than they can be built. Many technology-based companies buy other companies that have the technologies they need to enhance their own products. They do this because they can acquire the technology more quickly than developing it themselves, avoid royalty payments on patented technologies, and keep the technology away from competitors. For example, Apple bought Siri in 2010 to enhance its iPhones. In 2014, Apple purchased Novoris Technologies, a speech recognition technology company, to further enhance Siri's capabilities. In 2014, Apple also purchased Beats Electronics, which had recently launched a music streaming service. One reason for the acquisition was to quickly offer its customers a music streaming service, as the market was moving away from Apple's iTunes business model of purchasing and downloading music. Exploit a business's industry-specific scalability. Economies of scale are often cited as a key source of value creation in M&A. While they can be, you have to be very careful in justifying an acquisition by economies of scale, especially for large acquisitions. That's because large companies are often already operating at scale. If two large companies are already operating that way, combining them will not likely lead to lower unit costs. While economies of scale can be a significant source of acquisition value creation, rarely are generic economies of scale, like back-office savings, significant enough to justify an acquisition. Economies of scale must be unique to be large enough to justify an acquisition. Pick winners early and develop their businesses. The final winning strategy involves making acquisitions early in the life cycle of a new industry or product line, long before most others recognize that it will grow significantly. Johnson & Johnson pursued this strategy in its early acquisitions of medical device businesses. J&J purchased orthopedic device manufacturer DePuy in 1998, when DePuy had $900 million of revenues. By 2010, DePuy's revenues had grown to $5.6 billion, an annual growth rate of about 17%. This acquisition strategy requires a disciplined approach by management in three dimensions. Roll-up strategy. Roll-up strategies consolidate highly fragmented markets where the current competitors are too small to achieve scale economies. Beginning in the 1960s, Service Corporation International, for instance, grew from a single funeral home in Houston to more than 1,400 funeral homes and cemeteries in 2008. Similarly, Clear Channel Communications rolled up the U.S. market for radio stations, eventually owning more than 900. Size is not what creates a successful roll-up, what matters is the right kind of size. For Service Corporation, multiple locations in individual cities have been more important than many branches spread over many cities, because the cost savings, such as sharing vehicles, can be realized only if the branches are near one another. Roll-up strategies are hard to disguise, so they invite copycats. As others tried to imitate Service Corporation's strategy, prices for some funeral homes were eventually bid up to levels that made additional acquisitions uneconomic. Consolidate to improve competitive behavior. Many executives in highly competitive industries hope consolidation will lead competitors to focus less on price competition, thereby improving the ROIC of the industry. The evidence shows, however, that unless it consolidates to just 3 or 4 companies and can keep out new entrants, pricing behavior doesn't change. Smaller businesses or new entrants often have an incentive to gain share through lower prices. So in an industry with, say, 20 companies, lots of deals must be done before the basis of competition changes. Enter into a transformational merger. Transformational mergers can best be described by example. One of the world's leading pharmaceutical companies, Switzerland's Novartis, was formed in 1996 by the $30 billion merger of Ciba-Geigy and Sandoz. But this merger was much more than a simple combination of businesses. Under the leadership of the new CEO, Daniel Vasella, Ciba-Geigy and Sandoz were transformed into an entirely new company. In every area, there was no automatic choice for either the Ciba or the Sandoz way of doing things. Instead, the organization made a systematic effort to find the best way. Novartis shifted its strategic focus to innovation in its life sciences business. Organizational changes included structuring R&D worldwide by therapeutic rather than geographic area, enabling Novartis to build a world-leading oncology franchise. Buy cheap. The final way to create value from an acquisition is to buy cheap, in other words, at a price below a company's intrinsic value. Such opportunities are rare and relatively small. Nonetheless, although market values revert to intrinsic values over longer periods, there can be brief moments when the two fall out of alignment. Markets, for example, sometimes overreact to negative news, such as a criminal investigation of an executive or the failure of a single product in a portfolio with many strong ones. To gain control of a target, acquirers must pay its shareholders a premium over the current market value. Although premiums can vary widely, the average ones for corporate control have been fairly stable, almost 30% of the pre-announcement price of the target's equity. For targets pursued by multiple acquirers, the premium rises dramatically, creating the so-called winner's curse. Since it is based on an overestimation of the value to be created, the winner pays too much, and is ultimately a loser. Consider the stock market bubble during the late 1990s. Companies that merged with or acquired technology, media, or telecommunications businesses saw their share prices plummet when the market reverted to earlier levels. The possibility that a company might pay too much when the market is inflated deserves serious consideration.